Istanbul, 1876. While the Ottoman Empire bled from every border, one man was crowned with an impossible mission to save a 600-year-old empire from destruction. His name? Abdulhamid II. He inherited a throne on the brink of collapse, surrounded by external enemies and internal betrayals. But what he did next shocked the world. Abdulhamid II wasn't just another sultan. He was the last ruler to exercise absolute power over the Ottoman Empire, at a time when Europe called it the sick man. While powers like England and Russia lurked around his territories, eyeing them like vultures circling wounded prey, he attempted to modernize the empire using railways, telegraphs, and even spies to survive. The grandson of the great reformer Mahmud II found himself facing a crumbling legacy. The treasury was empty, the army was demoralized, and European powers were signing secret agreements to carve up what remained of Ottoman lands. In this desperate hour, Abdulhamid knew conventional tactics wouldn't be enough to save his ancestral realm. What makes Abdulhamid's story so fascinating is how a ruler once dismissed by Western historians as merely the Red Sultan, or Abdul the Damned, was actually a complex figure who understood the dangerous game of international politics. While publicly denouncing him, European diplomats privately admired his cunning ability to play great powers against each other, buying precious time for his empire. Did you know that when Abdulhamid ascended to the throne, the empire had already lost nearly 2/3 of its territory compared to its height under Suleiman the Magnificent 3 centuries earlier? Or that despite being portrayed as anti-modern, he established the empire's first electrical system and photography studio? The story of this sultan is not just about the decline of an empire. It's about a desperate struggle for survival against impossible odds. It's about a man who used every tool at his disposal: modernization, pan-Islamic unity, ruthless intelligence gathering, and diplomatic maneuvering to hold together the fragments of a once mighty state. But would all these efforts be enough? Could one man, even with absolute power, reverse the tide of history? If you love history and want to unravel the mysteries of great empires like this video, subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles and don't miss a single episode. Join us as we dive deep into the fascinating reign of the last absolute Ottoman Sultan and discover how his 33 years on the throne would forever change the face of the Middle East and the world. When Abdulhamid II took the throne in August 1876, he wasn't simply crowned, he was handed the keys to a burning house. The 34-year-old prince never expected to rule. In fact, he had spent most of his life in the shadow of the palace, far from power, focusing on carpentry and craftsmanship, skills that would ironically serve him well in rebuilding a shattered empire. His path to power came through tragedy and chaos. His uncle, Sultan Abdul Aziz, had been found dead under mysterious circumstances, officially ruled a suicide, though whispers of assassination never ceased. Then his own brother Murad V ascended to the throne, only to suffer a complete mental breakdown after just 3 months of rule. Palace physicians declared Murad unfit to govern, describing him as plagued by paranoid delusions and unable to perform basic functions of state. What few people know is that Abdulhamid personally visited his brother before accepting the throne. He found Murad in a pitiful state, trembling, incoherent, jumping at shadows. The empire needed leadership, and quickly. So on August 31st, with the empire crumbling around him, Abdulhamid reluctantly took the sword of Osman in the traditional ceremony at the Eyüp Sultan Mosque. What he inherited was nothing short of catastrophic. The imperial treasury wasn't just empty, it was drowning in debt. European banks controlled Ottoman finances through the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, essentially placing the empire's economy under foreign oversight. The annual interest payments alone consumed nearly 60% of all government revenue. Across the Balkans, once the prized European territories of the empire, rebellions erupted like wildfire, Bosnia was in open revolt. Bulgaria was seething with revolutionary ferment. Serbia and Montenegro were already at war with the empire. Romania was preparing to declare independence. Even Egypt, nominally an Ottoman province, operated with near total autonomy under British influence. But the greatest threat loomed from the north. Russia, the empire's historical nemesis, watched with predatory intent. Tsar Alexander II, emboldened by Ottoman weakness, was preparing for what he hoped would be the final blow to his southern rival. Russian pan-Slavic ideologues openly spoke of capturing Constantinople and restoring Orthodox Christianity to Hagia Sophia. Abdulhamid had been on the throne barely 5 months when disaster struck. In April 1877, Russia declared war, launching a massive two-pronged invasion. Russian forces poured across the Danube in the Balkans and stormed into eastern Anatolia from the Caucasus. The Ottoman army, underfunded and poorly equipped, fought valiantly but was overwhelmed by superior Russian numbers and firepower. By December, the situation had become desperate. Russian forces had captured the critical fortress of Plevna in Bulgaria after a bloody 5-month siege that cost tens of thousands of lives. The road to Constantinople lay open. Turkish refugees fled before the advancing Russian armies, bringing tales of atrocities that struck terror in the capital. In January 1878, Russian forces reached San Stefano, just 7 miles from Constantinople itself. From his palace windows, Abdulhamid could almost see the campfires of the Russian army. The 600-year-old empire appeared to be taking its final breaths. What's remarkable is that during this existential crisis, while his ministers panicked, Abdulhamid maintained an eerie calm. He spent hours alone studying maps, memorizing telegraph reports, and personally interviewing officers from the front. A British diplomat who met him during this period described him as possessed of a strange, fatalistic courage, as though he had already accepted the worst and was merely calculating how to survive it. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 nearly destroyed the Ottoman Empire. When the guns finally fell silent, Ottoman losses were staggering. Over 200,000 casualties, vital territories lost, and crushing war reparations imposed. The Treaty of San Stefano, dictated by Russia, threatened to remove the Balkans entirely from Ottoman control. Yet in this darkest hour, Abdulhamid revealed the diplomatic cunning that would become his trademark. He appealed to the other European powers, particularly Britain, playing on their fears of Russian expansion. Through intricate diplomatic maneuvering, he managed to secure the Congress of Berlin, where the harsh terms were somewhat modified, though still painful. This catastrophic war taught the young Sultan a lesson he would never forget. The Ottoman Empire could no longer compete militarily with European powers. If it was to survive, it would need to embrace new strategies, modernization, intelligence gathering, playing rivals against each other, and above all, avoiding direct military confrontation whenever possible. As one Ottoman official later remarked, "We entered the war as an empire of the 18th century and emerged as a desperate survivor of the 19th. The Sultan, who inherited an empire in flames, would now have to rebuild from the ashes or preside over its final dissolution." Having nearly lost his empire to Russian cannons, Abdulhamid II emerged from the crisis with a chilling realization. Military might alone could no longer protect the Ottoman realm. In an age of great power politics, survival would require subtler weapons, information, manipulation, and the strategic use of religion. Thus began the transformation of a sultan into what European diplomats would come to call the spider in the web. Abdulhamid's first innovation was to create the most extensive intelligence network the Ottoman Empire had ever seen. Unlike his predecessors, who relied on traditional spies among the elite, Abdulhamid cast a much wider net. His agents included barbers who collected gossip while trimming beards, coffee house owners who listened to political discussions, telegraph operators who intercepted messages, and even beggars stationed outside foreign embassies. The system was remarkably effective. Each morning, Abdulhamid would receive dozens of reports from across the empire and beyond. These weren't just summaries, they were detailed accounts of conversations, movements, and plots, all meticulously catalogued in the Sultan's private archives. A French diplomat once remarked in astonishment, "It seems the Sultan knows what we discuss in our embassy before our own government does." What made this network particularly effective was its unpredictability. No one knew who might be reporting to the palace. A seemingly loyal general could be under surveillance by his own servant. A reformist writer might find his private letters had somehow reached the Sultan's desk. This atmosphere of uncertainty bred caution among potential dissidents and gave Abdulhamid a psychological edge. Perhaps the most amusing account comes from the British ambassador Sir Nicholas O'Connor, who once complained that even his gardener was filing reports to the palace about which flowers he preferred, information the Sultan later used during a diplomatic reception to impress the ambassador with his detailed knowledge of English rose varieties. But the most incredible surveillance tool was Abdulhamid's own personal setup at Yıldız Palace. Unlike previous sultans who ruled from the ancient Topkapi Palace on the historical peninsula, Abdulhamid moved his residence to the hilltop Yıldız complex, which gave him a commanding view of the city. There, in a special room in his private quarters, he installed a powerful telescope through which he would personally observe the comings and goings in the capital. Imagine the scene. The absolute ruler of an empire of 25 million people hunched over his telescope like an amateur astronomer, except instead of studying distant stars, he was watching ship movements in the Bosphorus, diplomatic carriages entering embassies, or crowds gathering in public squares. On several occasions, he spotted fires in the city before the fire brigade was alerted and sent orders for immediate response. On the international stage, Abdulhamid developed an equally innovative strategy, pan-Islamism. As Sultan, he also held the title of Caliph, spiritual leader of the world's Muslims. Previous sultans had treated this religious role as secondary to their political position, but Abdulhamid recognized its enormous potential. With millions of Muslims living under British, French, and Russian colonial rule, Abdulhamid began to position himself as the protector of Muslims everywhere. He sent emissaries bearing gifts to Muslim communities from Morocco to Indonesia. He funded mosque constructions in places as far-flung as South Africa and Japan. He established scholarships for Muslim students from India, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia to study in Istanbul. The message was clear: attack the Ottoman Empire and you risk unrest among your Muslim colonial subjects. It was a masterful diplomatic lever that gave pause to imperial powers considering further Ottoman partition. One fascinating example of this strategy's effectiveness occurred in 1887, when a Russian newspaper published rumors that the Sultan planned to sell Jerusalem to European Jewish settlers. Abdulhamid immediately recognized this as an attempt to undermine his standing among Muslims. His response was brilliant. He dispatched trusted scholars to major Muslim cities, carrying personal letters affirming his commitment to protecting the holy sites, while simultaneously instructing Ottoman ambassadors to plant stories in European newspapers about growing Muslim unity under his leadership. Within weeks, the Russian rumor had backfired, actually strengthening Abdulhamid's position as guardian of Islamic holy places. The British Foreign Office noted with alarm how a fabricated story has been transformed by the Sultan's nimble diplomacy into a demonstration of his religious authority. Perhaps most remarkably, Abdulhamid achieved all this without leaving his palace. A notorious homebody, he rarely traveled beyond his palace grounds after an assassination attempt early in his reign. Yet from this self-imposed isolation, he manipulated international relations with remarkable effectiveness. When Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany visited Istanbul in 1898, he expected to meet a reclusive Oriental despot. Instead, he found himself charmed by a sophisticated ruler who seemed to know everything about German politics, industry, and even the Kaiser's personal preferences. "It was uncanny," Wilhelm later wrote to his cousin Tsar Nicholas II. "He spoke to me as if he had been present at our ministerial meetings in Berlin." Urdi, through his elaborate intelligence network and his skillful use of religious influence, Abdulhamid managed to keep his weakened empire intact for 3 decades against overwhelming odds. As one Ottoman official reportedly said, "Other sultans commanded armies. Abdulhamid commands secrets." While European powers mocked the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe, Abdulhamid II was quietly revolutionizing his realm, albeit in his own peculiar way. Unlike his predecessors who often adopted Western innovations wholesale, Abdulhamid pursued a selective modernization, embracing technology that strengthened central control while rejecting ideas that might undermine his authority. The railway became the most visible symbol of this Ottoman Renaissance. When Abdulhamid took the throne, the empire had barely 500 miles of railway tracks. By the end of his reign, that number had quintupled. These weren't just any railways, they were strategic arteries designed to strengthen the empire's cohesion and project Ottoman power. The crown jewel of this railway expansion was the legendary Hejaz Railway. This engineering marvel stretched over 1,000 miles from Damascus through the harsh Arabian desert to Medina, near Mecca. What made this project particularly remarkable was that it was funded largely through donations from Muslims worldwide, a testament to Abdulhamid's skill in harnessing religious sentiment for imperial projects. The Sultan personally examined the plans and even contributed funds from his private purse. More than just a transportation route, the Hejaz Railway served multiple purposes. It facilitated pilgrimage to the holy cities, accelerated troop movements to potentially rebellious provinces, and symbolically linked the distant Arabian territories to the Ottoman heartland. When the first train steamed into Medina in 1908, it was hailed as proof that Islamic civilization could master modern technology. A little-known fact about the railway is that each station along the route was equipped with a small mosque and Ottoman flags, creating islands of imperial presence in the vast desert. Local Bedouin tribes, initially hostile to this iron intruder in their ancestral lands, were gradually incorporated as railway guards, receiving regular salaries from Istanbul for the first time in their history. Even more transformative than railways was Abdulhamid's expansion of the telegraph network. If railways were the arteries of the empire, telegraphs were its nervous system. The Sultan was obsessed with communication speed. He personally ordered the construction of telegraph lines to every provincial capital and major garrison town. By 1890, an order from Istanbul could reach Damascus or Baghdad within hours rather than days or weeks. Abdulhamid utilized this new technology to bypass traditional power structures. Provincial governors found themselves receiving direct telegrams from the Sultan, questioning their decisions or demanding explanations, often based on reports from his local spies. The telegraph office in Yıldız Palace operated 24 hours a day, with operators working in shifts to ensure the Sultan could communicate at any moment. There's a fascinating story about how Abdulhamid once tested the system. Without warning, he sent identical telegrams to every provincial governor at 3 in the morning, asking about local conditions. The time each governor took to respond was carefully noted, and those who were slow-faced imperial displeasure. One unfortunate governor in Mosul, who took nearly 5 hours to respond, was immediately recalled to Istanbul. The Sultan's modernization extended to education as well. During his reign, the number of state schools increased from 200 to nearly 10,000. He established the empire's first modern universities, including engineering schools, medical colleges, and even a school for the civil service. Yet, characteristically, these institutions were designed to produce loyal technocrats rather than independent thinkers. But Abdulhamid's modernization always came with strings attached. The same telegraph lines that connected the empire also enabled unprecedented surveillance. The railways that transported goods and pilgrims could quickly move troops to crush rebellions, and the schools that taught modern science also instilled Ottoman patriotism and loyalty to the Sultan Caliph. Perhaps nowhere was this control more evident than in his approach to the press. While the early years of his reign saw a flourishing of newspapers and journals, Abdulhamid soon imposed strict censorship. Words like revolution, constitution, and even nose, because it could imply the Sultan was poking his nose into everything, were banned from publications. Newspapers would sometimes appear with entire columns blanked out by censors. The Sultan's paranoia extended to literature as well. Shakespeare's Hamlet and Macbeth were banned because they depicted the killing of monarchs. Even history books required careful editing to remove references to previous sultans who had been deposed. One publisher reportedly quipped, "Under Abdulhamid, we can write freely about anything, as long as we write about nothing." Those who defied these restrictions faced harsh consequences. Journalists were imprisoned, newspapers shuttered, and printing presses confiscated. Many intellectuals fled into exile, forming opposition groups in Paris, Geneva, and Cairo. Ironically, these exiles, the Young Turks, would eventually return to end Abdulhamid's reign. By the dawn of the 20th century, Abdulhamid had created a paradoxical state, an empire with modern infrastructure but medieval political control, with telegraph lines carrying censored messages and trains running on precise schedules to cities where secret police watched every movement. Did you know that Abdulhamid II was so afraid of being poisoned that he only ate food tested by official food tasters? His paranoia ran so deep that he had special meals prepared under guard and would often change his dining schedule at the last minute to prevent potential plotters from knowing when he would eat. If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of history's most fascinating rulers, like this video, share it with your history-loving friends, and subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles for more content just like this. And tell us in the comments, do you think Abdulhamid was a hero trying to save his empire or a tyrant clinging to power? Was his modernization program visionary or just another form of control? For 33 years, Abdulhamid II had ruled the Ottoman Empire with an iron grip. His network of spies, his telegraph wires and his railway lines had kept the fragile empire together against overwhelming odds. But even the most elaborate systems of control cannot last forever, and in the summer of 1908, the threads of the Sultan's web began to unravel. The revolution came not from the masses, but from within the very institutions Abdulhamid had strengthened. The Young Turks, a coalition of military officers, intellectuals and reformers, had grown increasingly frustrated with the Sultan's autocratic rule. Many had been educated in the very schools Abdulhamid had established, absorbing not just technical knowledge, but also Western political ideas that the Sultan had tried so hard to suppress. From their base in Salonika, today's Thessaloniki in Greece, these reformers had secretly organized within the ranks of the Third Army Corps. What Abdulhamid didn't realize was that his obsession with centralizing power had created a dangerous blind spot. By focusing his intelligence network on civilians, he had neglected to monitor his own military as closely. On July 23, 1908, the Young Turks made their move. Major Ahmed Niazi Bey, a charismatic officer, marched into the mountains with 200 soldiers and several civilians, issuing a proclamation demanding the restoration of the constitution that Abdulhamid had suspended 30 years earlier. Within days, other military units joined the rebellion. The Sultan's response was predictable. He ordered loyal troops to crush the rebellion. But now came the shock that would change history. Those loyal troops refused to fire on their fellow soldiers. Instead, they joined them. The rebellion spread like wildfire across Macedonia and soon threatened to consume the entire empire. What's particularly fascinating is how telegraph operators, once the Sultan's eyes and ears, became crucial to the revolutionary's success. When Abdulhamid ordered his officials to arrest the rebel leaders, these operators often delayed or altered the messages. Some even joined the revolution outright, sending warnings to potential targets. The very technology that had been the backbone of Abdulhamid's control was now being used against him. The most dramatic moment came on July 24th, when the Sultan received a telegram unlike any he had seen before. It was from the Revolutionary Committee, giving him 48 hours to restore the constitution or face the march of the Third Army on Constantinople. Abdulhamid, the master of information, found himself outmaneuvered by his own troops using his own communication system. Realizing his position was untenable, Abdulhamid made a startling announcement on July 24th. He would restore the constitution. The news triggered euphoric celebrations across the empire. In Constantinople, crowds of Turks, Greeks, Armenians, and Jews embraced in the streets. Political prisoners were released. Exiles returned home. Newspapers published without censorship for the first time in a generation. One headline simply read, "Freedom at last." For a brief moment, it seemed the Sultan had saved his throne through compromise. He appeared on the balcony of Yildiz Palace, waving to cheering crowds. To many observers, it looked like the beginning of a new era of constitutional monarchy. But Abdulhamid was playing a dangerous game. While publicly embracing constitutional rule, he was secretly plotting to regain full power. In April 1909, he made his move. Using religious sentiment and bribes, he encouraged a counter-revolution by conservative troops. For a few days, it seemed the old order might return. The Young Turks, however, had learned from their master's playbook. They swiftly organized their forces and marched on the capital. What followed was the 31 March incident, named after the date in the Islamic calendar, when the constitutionalist Action Army retook Constantinople and surrounded Yildiz Palace. After a tense standoff on April 27, 1909, the Ottoman Parliament made an unprecedented decision. They voted to depose Abdulhamid II. A delegation entered the palace to inform the Sultan of his fate. According to eyewitness accounts, Abdulhamid maintained his dignity but asked only one question: "What will become of me?" The answer was exile, not execution, as had been the fate of many deposed sultans before him. In the early hours of April 28th, the Sultan, who had rarely left his palace in decades, was escorted to Sirkeci railway station under heavy guard. Here comes the supreme irony. Abdulhamid was forced to board a special train bound for Salonika, the very city where the revolution against him had begun. The man who had built railways to strengthen his empire now found himself transported into exile on those same tracks. The train that carried him away was running on a schedule he himself had instituted, along tracks he had personally ordered built. What few people know is that as he boarded the train, Abdulhamid whispered to his aide, "The wheel of fortune turns in strange ways. The railways I built to save my empire now carry me from it." Whether this quote is apocryphal or authentic, it perfectly captures the poetic justice of the moment. In Salonika, the deposed Sultan was housed in Villa Alatini, where he would live for 3 years until the Balkan Wars forced his return to Constantinople. There, he lived under house arrest in Beylerbey Palace until his death in 1918. In his final years, he returned to his old hobbies of carpentry and writing, producing memoirs that he knew would never be published in his lifetime. The man who had once controlled an empire spanning 3 continents ended his days crafting wooden furniture and watching the Bosphorus from his windows. A silent witness to the final collapse of the Ottoman Empire he had fought so desperately to preserve. Abdulhamid's successor, his brother Mehmed V, was little more than a figurehead. Real power passed to the Young Turks, who would lead the Ottoman Empire into its final act, World War I, and its ultimate dissolution. Within a decade of Abdulhamid's deposition, the 600-year-old empire would cease to exist entirely. Perhaps the most telling epitaph came from a former opponent who visited the aging ex-sultan in his final years. He reported that Abdulhamid said, "They called me a tyrant, but look what freedom has brought the empire, disintegration. Perhaps history will say I was right to fear it." Whether he was right or wrong, Abdulhamid II was undeniably the last Ottoman sultan to rule with genuine power, the final chapter in the story of an empire that had once made the world tremble. As the train carrying Abdulhamid II disappeared into the distance that fateful April day in 1909, it marked more than just the end of a sultan's reign. It signaled the twilight of an entire era, the final chapter of absolute Ottoman rule that had shaped the Middle East and Eastern Europe for over 6 centuries. Abdulhamid II remains one of history's great paradoxes, a reactionary who embraced technology, a traditionalist who revolutionized infrastructure, a religious leader who employed modern surveillance techniques. He was a man caught between worlds, trying to preserve an ancient empire using the very tools of the modern age that was destroying it. For 33 years, this complex figure had held together the fraying threads of Ottoman power through a combination of diplomatic cunning, technological innovation, religious authority, and, yes, ruthless repression. He navigated the treacherous waters of European imperialism, playing great powers against each other while desperately modernizing his realm from within. The question that haunts historians to this day is whether any ruler, no matter how brilliant, could have prevented the Ottoman collapse. Was Abdulhamid fighting an impossible battle against the forces of nationalism, industrialization, and Western expansion? Or did his authoritarian methods actually accelerate the empire's demise by alienating the very reformers who might have saved it? What we do know is that the aftermath of his reign proved just how prescient some of his fears had been. The Young Turks who deposed him led the empire into the catastrophe of World War I. By 1922, the Ottoman Empire had vanished entirely from the map, replaced by new nation-states whose borders, many drawn by European powers, continue to shape conflicts in the Middle East to this day. Perhaps Abdulhamid's most lasting legacy lies in how he transformed the concept of the caliphate from a largely ceremonial title into a potent political tool. His use of pan-Islamic solidarity as a defensive strategy against European imperialism would inspire future movements across the Muslim world. Even after the empire's collapse, the ideas he championed about Islamic unity and resistance to Western dominance would echo through the 20th century and beyond. In his final years under house arrest, Abdulhamid reportedly spent hours watching the waters of the Bosphorus from his palace windows. According to his personal physician, he once remarked, "I'm like a doctor who diagnosed a fatal disease in his patient, the empire, and prescribed harsh medicine that everyone hated. Now they blame the doctor, not the disease." Whether this self-assessment was accurate remains for history to judge. What's certain is that Abdulhamid II's reign represents a fascinating case study in how empires adapt or fail to adapt to changing times. His story reminds us that even the mightiest powers must evolve or perish, and that sometimes even the most determined efforts can only delay, not prevent, the inevitable tides of history. The Ottoman Empire that had once stretched from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf, from Crimea to Algeria, ended not with a glorious last stand, but with a series of diplomatic conferences in European capitals. Abdulhamid had desperately tried to prevent this outcome, using every tool at his disposal, modern and medieval alike. That he ultimately failed does not diminish the remarkable tenacity with which he fought. If you've enjoyed this journey through one of history's most fascinating transitional periods, please hit that like button and share this video with others who appreciate the complex tapestry of the past. Subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles for more deep dives into pivotal historical figures who shaped our world. In our next episodes, we'll explore other rulers who faced impossible challenges at the crossroads of tradition and modernity. Remember, as Abdulhamid himself might have observed, understanding history isn't just about learning what happened, it's about understanding why empires rise, why they fall, and what lessons they leave for those who come after. Until next time, this is Modern Age Chronicles, bringing the past to life one story at a time.